Thank you all. We do apologise. The issue is to do with sound. We're trying to get the sound to work in this room so that you can all hear the interviews, which is very important. We were hoping to finish with a panel discussion after you'd seen the film and could comment on aspects of the film itself, but we'll have to do that now, of course. As I mentioned earlier, this film is sort of a labour of love of mine for the past couple of years, something that I've been interested in. And every time I keep finding a new story, it ends up being even more fascinating than what I found before. And one of the things that I'm hoping to do out of this is to try to track down the families of some of the soldiers who don't have living relatives here in Australia, try and track down their families in Albania, Indonesia, Malaysia, and elsewhere where they might be. But I think that in the absence of watching the film, I guess some of the things that I could talk about that if you have questions about are the types of men who are in the film. Some of them, having followed their stories quite closely, I have become a little bit attached to them as a result of that. Two of them I'd like to talk about just to start with are Muharrem Ali and Samsuddin bin Khatib. Muharrem Ali was something of his story is tragic, but also in a very inspiring sort of way, a story of courage and of adventure. He was born in Albania in 1910, and like many of the Albanian men who came to Australia during the 20s, he was about 15 or 16 when he left the country and came to Australia. He was participating in a type of migration that Albanians call Kokoda, which comes from an Arabic word, orba. But in the Albanian context, it refers to a temporary migration whereby an Albanian, usually a man, would leave his home village for a foreign country for a period of 2 to 3 years to earn money and then come back to Albania, usually to be replaced by a sibling who would do the same. In the 19th century, when Albania was part of the Ottoman Empire, they usually did this in Istanbul or Bulgaria or Greece or other parts of the Ottoman Empire at that time. After the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, they spread out further in Western Europe and sought work in Germany and other places. And by the 1900, many of the Kurdish migrants were going to the United States. In 1924, however, the United States government decided that they didn't want any more European migrants. They introduced a quota system, which meant that these migrants could no longer go to the United States. That's when they started coming to Australia. Now, because Australia is so far away, they weren't able to return home after 2 or 3 years quite quickly. It would be about a decade or so. In the meantime, many of them who did come to work found themselves isolated when World War II broke out, or specifically when Mussolini invaded Albania in April 1939. The interesting aspect about the Albanian community and the Albanian community in Shepparton in North Queensland was that religion Albanianness is the singular most important aspect that keeps coming up in terms of how Albanians organise their community. But religion ended up being a way, I guess, of coming into Australian society and forming community organisations. They recognised that the churches that were part of Australian cities were centres of community. They recognised that the churches that were part of other migrant communities, the Macedonians, the Greeks, and the other Southern European migrants formed a big part of their community and centres of their community. In Shepparton, they were organising prayer services in a sort of makeshift mosque, we think in the 1930s. And by the 1950s, once it was realised that they had to stay in the country, they started building mosques here in Victoria and in Queensland. Labour Jamali and Muharrem Ali were part of these stories. Muharrem Ali, in particular, one of the things about him is when he was buried in Ambon, well, he was buried, of course, after he passed away as a POW, but when they built a grave for him, or made a headstone for him, they put a cross on his grave. And we've been trying to figure out why they put a cross on his grave. Is it because this was a default? And this is one of the suggestions. I know that another soldier I mentioned who was shot down over France, they put a cross on his grave as well. That was the standard thing that they did at the time. Or was it because he married an Anglo-Australian, because he married an Anglo-Australian woman, and whether this would have something to do with it. From his name, he was likely a Bektashi Muslim, so his strictness in religion, probably on religious boundaries, and of course Albania at the time, there was lots of intermarriage between Muslims and Christians. This may have not been such an issue for him anyway, but it does form an interesting part of the story, especially when you see another soldier like Kurt Ali Rahman, who unfortunately we can't include in this story, in this film, who has no emblem on his grave. The fact that he enlisted his religion as Muslim meant that when they were, he was buried in the mud where he died, when they did move him to a cemetery in Port Moresby, they put no emblem on his grave. So they, well, we can't put a cross, we can't put a Star of David, so we'll put no emblem on his grave. And that's one of the interesting aspects of this story. The second person who's also a fascinating person, and we couldn't include everything about him, is Samsudin bin Khatib, who was an Indonesian migrant from Sumatra, from the Minangkabau ethnic group, who came as a very young man and worked very hard as a pearl diver, was eventually recruited into Z Special Force and served in Labuan and Borneo. But when he came back from the war, he decided, he settled in Melbourne and decided to become he was working in a factory. And in the factory, he became very much influenced not only by what was going on in Australia at the time, about union activity, but also he was influenced by the Indonesian independence movement. He renounced his Dutch nationality, he wanted to stay in Australia, and he was involved in both the union movement and the Indonesian independence movement here. In the end, he was considered a troublemaker and he was deported. And despite the efforts he had, or the people around him had, saying this is a person who risked his life for this country, you can't just deport him. Arthur Caldwell, who was the immigration minister at the time, who had a specific agenda, which was a white Australian agenda, made sure that he was deported from the country. Unfortunately, we don't know what really happened to him, but he seems to have passed away about 2 years later. It's quite a sad story. But hopefully, when we get the sound right, we can bring these stories to the screen. But I'm willing to answer any questions or pass them on to the next panel member who wants to. Simon, do you want to say a few words about making the film, perhaps?
Yes, a film project like this that just comes on my desk doesn't necessarily seem interesting initially, right? So I've not been part of the process of coming up with the subject. So it was presented to us, and I thought there certainly would seem a 15-minute film in it, which is what, in terms of the agreement with the Veteran Affairs was. But it very rapidly became clear that this wasn't a story of just sort of documenting the men who'd been to war. This was a story about migration and the impact of war on migrants. And that's what makes it so interesting. And that's what made it very rapidly change from being a 15-minute film to something much longer. And although our agreement was to come here with a 15-minute film, to quote Mark Twain, I didn't have enough time to make a 15-minute film. I was really pushing it to make a 45-minute or the 40-minute film that you've got. And it's not the end of it, as there's all these other stories. And I suppose in one film we can't put everybody's story in it, but I think in the end this is showing a really interesting insight into the diversity and complexity of how these migrant men got into the armed forces and the diversity of impacts it has on them going out the other side. And it was very fortunate that we had the Jamali family to interview and learn from about how the success of that, in some ways, terrible as the impact on labour, the experience of war must have been, he still flourished as a result of the world that had opened up after the war, because he was intending to go back to Albania. But the other story that we would like to get more of is the story of Abu Qasim. Although that very sad aspect of that, it's very topical because of the family that it's connected to. And very complicated family and family story of Indigenous Australians in our interface between migration and tradition. So these were really interesting stories, and I think the film does them justice. The problem we have at the moment is that the sound, when we plug the picture in, the sound is sucked off to the projector, and we're not going to hear it very well. So we're just trying to find. Mohammed is working very hard to try and fix the technical problem that seems to be in the server room. And he's coming up with another speaker system, hopefully, that we can have a better chance of being able to hear. Because it's very interview based, so we want to hear more people. So I'm sorry about this, but this film is hot off the press. It really is. I finished outputting it at 4 o'clock. We didn't get a chance to test it.
And Mary, do you want to talk a little bit about your father?
Look, I can, absolutely. Dad left home in Albania in 1937 as a 16-year-old. He was effectively a child. You want me to stand up, speak up? A bit louder? Okay, I am a teacher, I can. So Dad came out in 1930s. He left his homeland, he left Albania as a 16-year-old. And he left as a child. He was sent out here to work and send money back home to his mother, who was bringing up 7 other children. 2 of them were of her own, and 8 of them were my dad's first cousins, both of his parents had died and were left as orphans. So Dad was sent out here alone, and from what we've been told, he cried all the way pretty much on the boat coming out here. And he arrived in 1938, and very quickly he got a job. He bought a bicycle. With his first week's pay, he was able to pay for a shepherd back home for a whole month. He paid for his rent, and he bought his bicycle, and he was off. And Dad did use his bicycle. He travelled around Victoria as they did in those days. He went to Ballarat, and he went to Omeo on his bike, and he worked on the land. And that was pretty typical of those young immigrants that came out in those days. The war came upon us, and we know about the war, but Dad was an adventurer. Of course he was an adventurer. He came across from the other side of the world, and he was going to enlist, and he wasn't going to have anybody denying him that opportunity, despite the fact that he wasn't of age yet. Dad decided that he was going to sign his own documents and make up the story that he was already 21, and he enlisted as a 20-year-old. And off he went. They went to North Africa to begin with. There wasn't a great deal happening in North Africa. I don't really know what Dad did there. There was stuff that happened, but we're not privy to that. I heard the good stories. I heard about him going up and touching a mummy in one of the pyramids. Things that we wouldn't be allowed to do today, of course. So those sorts of stories. He was there, I think, with one of his best friends as well, but they were rushed back to Australia because the Japanese had started their attacks in the Pacific, and they raced them back, and Dad was raced back to Townsville, hit the 2nd 23rd Battalion. They did a couple of weeks military training, jungle training, and they were very quickly sent back out to Papua New Guinea. And that story of Dad and his experiences there are a really horrific feeling. And it's the same story for all those soldiers that went there. It was something that he couldn't speak about. I, in Year 9, was asked to interview someone that we knew about the Second World War. I thought, beauty, I'll go home and I'll interview my dad. And he burst into tears. I got nothing. He was, it was too much. So I got nothing from Dad, and that's when I realised that we were never going to be able to hear those stories, that he was always going to keep them to himself. My oldest brother, Aslan, did hear quite a few stories. He was older than me, and probably more aware of when Dad was speaking on those rare occasions. He was able to understand what Dad was talking about. So Dad, he got through the war. He was wounded in action in 1943 in Fincham Harbour, and he carried that shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. Eventually, everything rounded up in New Guinea. He came back to Australia and was released from service in 1946. And Dad then proceeded to get back into society as they did and work. He did lots of different jobs, but one of the things about being a Muslim, not that he was an active, overt, practicing Muslim, but Dad was actively involved in helping build the mosque in Shepparton in Carlton and in Mareeba as well, with his own efforts. He had a truck when he was down here in Victoria, and he helped deliver the bricks to the mosque in Carlton. So there was those sorts of things. They're not astounding stories, but you know, it was his way of contributing. It took a long time for Dad to get back to what we would call normal life. He returned back to Albania in the early 60s. The communist government didn't allow him to go back in at that time, so he went around to Montenegro on the advice of a good buddy, and that's where he met my mum. And that was that's what I call Dad's second story of immigration. So he came back, he brought Mum back, took her to Mareeba because she was from the middle of a beautiful town on the Adriatic coast, a place called Deakin, and took her to inland Queensland, which, let's just put it this way, Mum only stayed there for 4 years and said, get me out of here. So they came down to Shepparton, and we lived in Shepparton, in Dunkirk Avenue for all of you Sheppartonites for a few years, and then Dad achieved his dream of his own orchard in Kyabram, and that was his happy place. Dad was funny with us at home. He was that's where he was happiest, on that orchard. He had a real broad friendship, a group of friends in our community, and he was were really part of the Shepparton and Kyabram Albanian community. Sadly, Dad, things did catch up with him, and his health deteriorated. He was very unwell, and he passed away in 1991. He was buried with military honours at the Shepparton Cemetery, and it took many, many months for the plaque to be put on his grave because the Department of Veterans Affairs was researching the correct symbol that needed to be placed on his plaque, and that being the Crescent on one side, and of course the Veterans Affairs symbol on the other side. So, and then that was done, and Dad was buried there. And his story lives on with us, and we're a very proud family, of course. And it's only now, as we get older, that we realise his contribution to, not only to, as a veteran, but also to the Alamein community in Shepparton and Mareeba. Yes. Yeah.
Because I know you have a good and very good discussion. Do you have the bike?
Do I have?
The bike.
We don't have the bike. No, I wish we did. Yeah.
I maybe come one time to American and attack.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, unfortunately we don't. But we've still got the very first car. So when I was born in Mareeba, and I'm going to tell you now exactly how old I was born in 1965. And Dad, out of joy, went and bought himself a Ford Fairlane, and let me tell you, that was the only car that we had. I had to learn to drive in that Ford Fairlane. It was a 1959, I beg your pardon, 1959 Ford Fairlane, and we've still got it. Yeah, can I just say that Dad did eventually get back to Albania. He went in 1973, and the most poignant part of that was that he left as a child. He left his family as a child, and he returned as a middle-aged man in 1960. Back in 1973, I should say.
Child in here, but he's all very mature. In that time, he was very mature to come in the world.
Yeah.
It is one of the interesting aspects of it because, he would have been a changed man when he came back from Papua New Guinea as well. And this is something that you do see a lot. It's one of these things when you read, so reading through Lev Jamali's record, his service record, is even though he had to be very mature to come out to Australia and work, he still was a 20-year-old. So the amount of time he's being disciplined for not obeying orders, for sleeping in, and the rest of it, and this is not uncommon, of course, for soldiers of his age. And this is, I think, the Anzac story has kind of gotten over that fact by saying, they're larrikins, of course, larrikins, but it's also they're 20-year-olds, they're risk takers, they're doing stupid things, and they're disobeying orders, and that happened a lot. Looking at the Z Force, the Special Forces, is the first form of Special Forces in Australia. A lot of those soldiers were selected because they were risk takers, or they were disobedient, or they needed people who could think autonomously. You could drop them into the jungle and they could make their own decisions. So they often chose men who had been in trouble for things such as striking an officer. So that's some of the interesting things that have come out of these stories. One of the areas that I've really found most powerful about this is when I've looked at the photos of these men. So I know when I found out about Muharrem Ali in 2017, and I've been reading as much as I could about him. And when I was able to actually get his digitized record and to see what he looked like and think, wow, he was a striking man. Like he's a strong-looking man, and to know that he was reduced to he died of starvation. For a man like that, it's incredible. It reminded me of when I was in school, when we would commemorate Anzac Day. I remember a teacher saying to us, because we were 11-year-olds, 10-year-olds, I know you find this boring, but you need to be silent for 1 minute. And you need to be silent for 1 minute because somewhere in the past there was someone who was dying, and they would value the fact that you sat there for that 1 minute in their memory. And looking at the photo of Muharrem Ali and some of the other men, that reminded me of that. Thinking this man, it's a photo of him the day he enlisted, not knowing what lay ahead for him, which was terrible things lay ahead for him. He was never going to leave the army. That perhaps for him, knowing that, well, as he was dying in a stretcher in Ambon, that years later, people will be looking into his eyes, into his picture, thinking about him and also trying to tell his story. And that's something that I hope it validates the sacrifice, if that's a possible thing to do in a small way. But yeah, that's really how I felt about this project.